Welcome to the Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight, we're starting a new letter, Philippians chapter, I guess too many of this stuff going on. Chapter 1. Rabbi, thank you for joining me and tolerating my so many challenges today. It's been pretty rough today. But we finally made it. So here we are.
We're starting Jewish time.
Oftentimes I'll say we're in dog years. We'll be 20 minutes in dog years. So that's quite a big drastic change. Oh man. So yeah, it's going to be a really fun show tonight. We're entering the whole new thing with the there I go again. Ephesians. No. Yes. Why do I have Ephesians is right or no?
You got Ephesians on your mind.
Man, what is up with that? That is Philippians. Why did I put Ephesians on there? That is so weird. And see, that's what's been conflicting me. I typed this up like an hour ago. And in fact, I need to change that now because somebody's going to say, what book are you in? Philippians. I'm changing that now. Philippians 1. Daggum it.
We're in Ephesians chapter 7.
Yeah, hey, there you go. There you go. See, I wasn't wrong. It was just a typo. Okay.
It's like someone once said that someone asked them how tall they were. They said they were 5'13".
That's what I say when people ask me how old I am. I'm like, I'm actually 49 plus 1. So, or 40, or the first year of my 49th birthday, the second year of my 49th birthday. That's what it was, something like that. So, okay. So now YouTube has been updated. I can't believe it. Oh man. There's benefit to wait until it's just about time because then I'm freshly looking at things. I was basing everything on my goofy memory, apparently. So, all right, YouTube is updated. Now I've got to go back after the show and fix the silly thumbnail. No, actually, the thumbnail is great. Thank you. That's because it took like 20 minutes to make that little thumbnail image. So I don't have to change it. That's accurate. Now everything is good to go. We're rocking. I'll have to edit Facebook in a little while, but besides that, we're good. So, Rabbi, welcome back again.
Good to be back with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And okay, new letter.
New letter. Here we go.
I sometimes make the mistake of referring to these as like a new book, but it's not really the book of Philippians. It's a letter.
Right.
Let's not fool ourselves. Okay, so this is apparently Paul's letter. And this is to the church in Philippi. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. My Greek is not that good. Philippi or Philippi. It's got to be one of those two. And he begins in verse 1. He tells us who his audience is, who is the recipient of the letter, and he refers to them as all the saints in Messiah Jesus and in the Messiah, who were at this church in Philippi. And it's interesting that I think most of the translations that I saw translate this as to all the saints. But in the NIV, the New International Version, they have it as to all God's holy people. To all of God's holy people. And that was sort of seconded by the Amplified Version. I don't usually refer to the Amplified Version. It's actually quite interesting, and it's a very, I think, helpful tool. And I think it was a woman actually that put it together, and she understands that this letter is going to. She refers to them as God's sacred people. Now, I think the reason this is interesting, I mean, if this is an accurate translation, is that there's a little bit of a replacement theology kind of going on here, because the definition of God's people now seems to undergo some changes, meaning that throughout the Hebrew scriptures, God's holy people, God's sacred people, are the people of Israel. Actually, we had this in this week's Torah portion that we read yesterday, the chapter called Mishpatim. So I think it was in the last verse in chapter 22, God speaks to the people of Israel and says, Anshe Kodesh Tihiyu li. You shall be a holy people to me, a sacred people to me. And it seems that throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Hebrew Bible, whenever it refers to God's people, right, God's special nation, God's special people, it's referring to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's referring to the people of Israel. And we know this already. We've discussed this already. But Paul here seems to be opening this up to others, meaning that he's speaking here to a primarily Gentile audience. The church in Philippi was presumably the majority or all were Gentile. And Paul is including them. Paul is giving them the same designation as it had been previously applied only to the children of Israel. So we know that from a Christian point of view, this amounts to a kind of replacement theology, because you could say at this point that Paul's speaking to everyone. He's speaking to all the Gentiles in the church and all the Jews in the church. But we know that, within 100 years or so, there are no more Jews in the church. So really the only people that Paul really would be considering as God's holy, sacred people would be the church, which is basically going to become all Gentile. He might believe that, the people of Israel still have some special standing in the eyes of God, but for his point of view, only if they come to faith in Jesus. So it's interesting that Paul seems to expand the concept of what does it mean to be God's holy people, God's sacred and special people. Now, what I found a little bit humorous, I've over the years that we've been doing this show, I've often made reference to David Stern's New Testament commentary, his Jewish New Testament commentary. And here, Paul, I'm not familiar with the Greek terms, but the way these Greek terms are usually translated, when he speaks about the saints who believe in Jesus, who are at Philippi, he says, with their overseers and deacons. So he's including here, he's specifically addressing the leadership of the church there. And David Stern translates these words, the Greek, whatever the Greek is, instead of saying to the overseers and deacons, he translates it as to the congregational leaders and the shamashim. Now, I think there's a little bit of humor here. I don't think that David Stern was trying to be funny, but it actually strikes me as funny. Congregational leaders is, a pretty neutral kind of expression. It doesn't sound very churchy. So that could be the kind of word that could easily apply to a Jewish congregation. But the word shamashim, so we know that, it's typical that a synagogue will have someone that's designated as a shamash. Shamash is basically, you could say, the sextant. I don't know if this is a good English translation, but the shamash is the person that basically doesn't have a leadership role in the synagogue so much, but carries out certain functions. He might set up, for a ceremony. He might move the tables. He might be the person to make sure that the Torah is rolled to the proper place.
You bring up a question, Rabbi. So the shamash, isn't that also the title given for the center candle on the
right? Meaning that for the same reason, meaning that it's the name for the center candle, or really it doesn't have to be the center; it could be on the sides either.
Right.
But it's not one of the candles that are lit for Hanukkah. The word shamash literally
like
means
servant.
Helper.
Yeah, right.
Right, helper, a servant, in the sense that you don't want to use one of the Hanukkah candles to light another Hanukkah candle, and also
so
there's an issue. You're not supposed to make use of the light of the Hanukkah candles, meaning that the light of the Hanukkah candles is strictly for, the mitzvah,
Right.
the precept of lighting Hanukkah candles. It's not so that you could, let's say, read. So we light an additional candle called the shamash, the helper, so that, we could say that if you're getting some kind of benefit from the light, you're getting it from the shamash. And we use that one. Again, it's almost there as an assistant. It's helping you light the other candles.
So the reason why I asked that is because, in the whole Messianic thing, of course, Christians don't celebrate Hanukkah, but Messianics, I would say that that center Shamash candle represents Yeshua. But if Yeshua really doesn't have any further purpose than to move tables around or whatever the case may be, like you said, it's like, is that really a good way to describe or to try to pin that title on him?
Well, again, they're not referring back to the shamash of a synagogue,
okay,
right? Who's like the custodian,
right?
They're speaking about it. I mean, again, the misconception is that the shamash is always in the middle of the Chanukiah, right? So somehow everything points to that higher candle. I mean, it's sort of a very sloppy symbolism, and it's again, I think, reaching too far from their point of view. But what I found funny about David Stern's translation is that he speaks about these, what everyone else refers to as deacons. He insists on calling them shamashim. So it's possible that you could have more than one shamash in a congregation, in a synagogue. So, here he uses the plural shamashim. But the problem is that the church in Philippi was a Gentile church, and it's pretty clear that they didn't refer to these people as shamashim. I mean, it would have been a misunderstood, a non-understood word if they were referring to these deacons or custodians or whatever they were. They wouldn't have used the Hebrew term shamashim. But obviously, David Stern wants to use that kind of term in his New Testament translation because he's allergic to anything that sounds like Gentile churchianity. So to speak about deacons, Jews would never relate to someone in a synagogue that's called a deacon. So he's driven by this need to, have euphemisms for all of the Christian cultural terms. And so his agenda really is to try to show how quote unquote Jewish, the church is. And so he uses in this Gentile church a term which was really out of place. And what's absurd really about this kind of agenda, and he does it throughout his translation of the of the Christian Bible, is that he will change the New Testament names from, Matthew becomes Matityahu, and John becomes Yochanan, and James becomes Yaakov, and Peter becomes Kepha. So he wants to make all those changes because, again, Matthew doesn't sound like a very Jewish name, and John doesn't sound very Jewish. But he leaves Isaiah as Isaiah and doesn't change it to Yeshayahu, which is the Hebrew. He doesn't change Jeremiah to Yirmiyahu. He doesn't change Ezekiel to Yecheskel. So it's a very transparent kind of translation agenda, where the only things really that get changed, it's being changed not because it's more accurate. These people that were serving in the church in Philippi, they were not called shamashim. Whatever the Greek term was, that would have been the term that was used. It was a Greek term. So why not just use an English translation here, meaning that David Stern's translation is into English. And so his sort of borrowing a Hebrew term for his English translation of the Greek is really absurd. And it follows through on his agenda of just trying to take everything in the Christian Bible that doesn't sound Jewish and make it sound more Jewish. Whereas, Isaiah sounds Jewish enough, and he has no need to do any surgery on these names. Now, one of the questions I started thinking about when I was reading this first chapter, because we know that Paul reminds me of some of these, candidates that are trying to become, presidential candidate, of these people running in the primaries. You had a field of 20 people running around, like crazy, killing themselves to, become the Democratic candidate in the presidential election. And, it's quite amazing. I mean, it's interesting. Here you have a 78-year-old Jewish guy, Bernie Sanders, when they were questioning his health, he says, you run around like me to do 3 rallies a day, try and see if you can keep up with me. And Paul was like that. Paul seemed to be tireless, running around. He didn't have the kind of transportation we have now. He was going, very slowly in these boats, these ships, maybe overland sometimes in a caravan, who knows what, a donkey, a camel. But he was incredibly productive. He was running around to no end. And we know that one of the things that he was doing, to use his terminology, is that he was planting churches. He was starting up these churches. And so one of the questions I thought about was, who were the people when he came to one of these cities, which were basically Gentile cities, who was he preaching to? How did Paul reach out to people? Did he put ads in the paper saying there's going to be a seminar about salvation? Did he just go up and down the street handing out tracts? Did he knock on people's doors? I mean, it's hard to picture what his mode of operation would have been. And, to me, I think there are 2 possible groups that he might have encountered. He might have encountered people in these cities who were total pagans. And the problem would be, how would he meet these pagans to preach to them? They probably wouldn't be coming to any kind of mass rallies that he would call, because I'm not sure that total pagans would be interested in what he was selling. And I don't think that total pagans would relate to a lot of what Paul was speaking about. Paul's always quoting from the Bible. I don't know if people that were totally pagans would have cared, that Paul's ideology is backed up by Scripture. So I find that hard to imagine. But the other possibility is that Paul was possibly preaching to what we refer to as Yirei Elokim, God-fearers. And we know that back in the first century, there were probably hundreds of thousands of non-Jews in the ancient world that were pretty much admirers of Judaism. They were attracted to the history of the Jewish people. They were attracted to the story of the Jewish people. They were attracted to the morality and ethics of the Jewish people. They were attracted to the whole 9 yards. They weren't at a stage in life where they really felt conversion was a reasonable or possible option. I mean, many of them, again, didn't live in Jewish communities. It wasn't possible to convert if you're living, in a place where there's no Jewish communities. Where would they actually learn from, and where would there be a rabbinical court to convert them? And they probably had other obstacles. I mean, I'm not sure how many men would have wanted to get circumcised back then, especially when they didn't have the ultra sharp stainless steel tools that we have today. So, they were people that were really attracted to Judaism. They were sort of, in some ways, Jewish wannabes, but they, for whatever reasons, didn't end up converting. And we know that when there were Jewish communities, these God-fearers would often hang out in the synagogues. They would basically come to the synagogues, and they would, either watch what was going on or they would try to participate. But we know that there was a significant number of these God-fearers in the ancient world. And And it's possible that even when there was no Jewish community, these people got together on their own to study and or to worship. And so it's possible that when Paul came to these areas, he was able to preach to these people. They would have been conceivably very open to Paul's understanding of the Tanakh, meaning that if he was going to speak about biblical things, they wouldn't find it irrelevant. And they may have been attracted to Paul's teaching that to become part of God's special people, they don't need to observe the 613 commandments and get circumcised, etc. All they need to do is to accept Jesus into their hearts. And so when I think about how Paul was able to go about his program of starting up these churches in these primarily non-Jewish areas, this is probably, if I had to guess, who he was primarily speaking to, rather than trying to communicate with people that were worshiping, animals, or, Saturn or the moon. I think that he would have had a tremendous amount of success potentially with these God-fearers. Now, I'm going to make another point a few times tonight that I've made so many times already, but for some reason, I think it's important to keep on pointing this out. And we're going to find this a lot in Philippians, that Paul consistently seems to distinguish between Jesus and God, meaning that Paul does not come out and make a definitive, clear statement that Jesus is God. He says, for example, in verse 2, he wishes the Philippians grace to you and peace from who? So it's peace from God our Father and from the Messiah Jesus. So it's not Jesus who is God. He doesn't identify, he doesn't speak about that Jesus here, the Messiah, is God the Father. He doesn't teach any kind of equivalence. He speaks about them as two separate entities. So I believe that, again, from Paul's point of view, and we've seen this many, many times already, Paul is consistently distinguishing between Jesus and God. He does seem to understand that Jesus is some kind of obviously special being, potentially pre-existent, potentially some kind of angelic being, maybe not, a normal human being, but seems to be, in Paul's view, some kind of mediator or intermediary for helping human beings come to God. But he, as far as I can see, all the texts we've studied so far, he's consistent in distinguishing between Jesus and God. So he goes on in verse 3, he says, I thank my God in all of my remembrance for you. And it's a sort of very lovey-dovey letter. This letter, he, is constantly speaking about his warm feelings about the church in the city. And again, the question I have is, when Paul says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, who does Paul have in mind when he says these words, my God? What does Paul mean by that? When he says my God, does he refer to the Trinity? Is Paul thinking, when he says my God, of Father, Son, Holy Spirit? When he says my God, is he thinking, oh, that's Jesus? Or when he says my God, is he thinking about God, the creator of heavens and earth, what we probably, normally call God the Father? Jews refer to God as Avinu B'Shamayim, our Father in heaven. So my read of Paul is that when he speaks about God, he has in mind the normative biblical concept of God simply as God the Creator, and that's it. Nothing else. As the Bible consistently says, Ein od milvado. There's nothing else other than God, this Creator. And what's interesting is that in this passage here, from verse 3 to verse 11, he again consistently distinguishes between Jesus and God. So in verse 8, for example, he says, "For God is my witness, how I yearn for you all with the affection of the Messiah Jesus." So again, he's not saying that the Messiah Jesus is God. He speaks about God is my witness about something concerning the Messiah Jesus. He distinguishes, he differentiates between God and Jesus. And also in verse 11, the same thing. He speaks about being filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through the Messiah Jesus to the glory and praise of God. Again, so you see here that for him, Jesus really is really a mediator toward God, because he speaks about righteousness coming through the Messiah. For what purpose? To the glory and praise of God. It doesn't say to the glory and praise of Jesus or glory and praise of the Messiah. It's the Messiah that somehow is able to accomplish something vis-a-vis God. So again, I believe that Paul is fairly consistent in how he sees this. Now, the next piece, starting in verse 12 and going to verse 18, is the where I got the title for tonight's program. This is about Paul's reflecting on the spreading of the Christian message, the spreading of the gospel, as he calls it. And he says, interestingly, we know that Paul writes about in this chapter, having been a prisoner. He was held prisoner many times in his life. He was in prison. And he observes, he says in verse 15, that some indeed preach the Messiah from envy and rivalry. So apparently there were people who Paul has an issue with. He believes that their preaching of the Messiah was possibly to gain followers, to gain applause. It could be that these are people that were jealous of Paul's successes, and they wanted to cause him grief or cause him harm. Especially, he's locked up in prison. He's sort of vulnerable. He's easy to get to in a sense. So Paul realizes that there are people out there preaching out of what he refers to as rivalry and envy. He speaks about these people again in verse 17. They proclaim the Messiah out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Meaning that for some reason, these people have it out for Paul. And maybe they believe that Christianity should have a different champion, another, primary leader, primary advocate. And so this is one group that Paul's aware of, but Paul contrasts them in verse 15. He said, but others, they preach the Messiah from goodwill, meaning that they apparently are people that have goodwill towards Paul, meaning that the first group really are antagonistic towards Paul, but others, they have goodwill towards Paul. And then he says about these people that in verse 16, he says, these people that have goodwill, he says, they do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel, or in some translations, that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. Now, again, this is a topic that we've discussed in the past. Paul has always claimed that he was appointed to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul claims that this came from Jesus, it came from God. But again, it's only a claim. And so here when Paul says that these people know that I have been appointed for the defense of the gospel, they don't really know. How would these people in the church of Philippi know that Paul had any communication with Jesus or with God? So all that it really is saying is that they accepted Paul's claim. That's really what Paul should have said, that they know. They have no way of knowing. They simply seem to have accepted at face value without questioning Paul's claim that he was divinely appointed for this task. Now, what Paul says about both these groups in verse 18 is the controversial verse. Paul says, "What then?" He says that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, the Messiah is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. The HCSB Study Bible says that basically Paul refused to condemn these people that were preaching for improper motivations. He was aware of the fact that these people were jaundiced, or these people were jealous, or these people were trying to harm him. He was aware that there was something wrong going on here, and yet the HCSB Study Bible says that he refused to criticize them. He refused to condemn them as long as the gospel was preached. Meaning, from Paul's point of view, it seems that the ends justify the means. That from Paul's perspective, as long as faith in Jesus was being spread, Paul was willing to put up with quite a bit. Now, we've seen in our previous studies several other examples of this. For example, we saw that in the book of Acts, there were a number of times when Paul came under suspicion. He was accused of being someone who teaches not just Gentiles, but he teaches Jews as well. You know, when he's out in the diaspora preaching, he's teaching Jews as well as Gentiles. They don't need to observe the Torah. They don't need to keep the commandments. They don't need to circumcise their children. This is the accusation against Paul. And we know that when he comes to Jerusalem, that's when these accusations are thrown up in his face. And so in the 21st chapter of Acts, we know that the disciples in Jerusalem were concerned about these accusations, and they wanted Paul to undergo basically a trial. They wanted to put Paul to the test to see if he's willing to observe the Torah. And we know that they had these people who had been Nazarites, people who had taken a vow for a particular amount of time that they would not cut their hair, they would not drink any wine. And now their term has come to an end. And we know that we're taught in the book of Numbers that the Nazir, when their term came to an end, they would have to come to Jerusalem, and they would have to bring special sacrifices in the temple. Interestingly, these sacrifices included a sin offering, a korban chatat. And the people in Jerusalem, they asked Paul to purify himself as well as purify these people, because again, if you were ritually impure, you couldn't even go into the temple area. So Paul and these men, they undergo purification, and Paul sponsors their sacrifices. Apparently, he pays for their sacrifices. Now, we know that Paul's teaching on the sacrificial system was very clear. Paul, throughout his teachings, basically says that Jesus is the final sacrifice, and he atones for all sins. And as far as Paul seems to be concerned, there's no need anymore for sin offerings in the temple. So Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal suggests that they chose this particular observance on purpose, meaning that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. They could have had Paul do any number of things to prove that he was Torah loyal. But they chose this possibly because they wanted him specifically to be involved with the offering of a sin offering, something that, you know, they had heard that Paul was teaching against. We know that the apostles in Jerusalem didn't stop going to the temple after Jesus was killed. They continued going to the temple and worshiping in the temple and participating in the sacrificial services. And so they wanted Paul to do the same thing. They wanted to make sure that his ideology was not off, was not anti-biblical. And what does Paul do? I think Paul takes an attitude which is, I'll do what it takes. If I need to do this to get these people off my back, I'll do it. And I don't believe that Paul wanted to do it, because what we know about Paul is that he is consistently under suspicion for basically teaching against the observance of the Torah. And we know that in the 2nd century, that's how the Ebionites and Nazarenes saw him, as someone who was a heretic and apostate to the Torah. And, we know that throughout the Christian Bible itself, he has people that are opposing his teachings. And we know that the Pauline church, the people that became historical Christianity, were likewise anti-Torah observance. They actually persecuted the Jewish Christians that wanted to observe the Torah. They were persecuted by Paul's followers because they got the memo from Paul. They understood that according to Paul's teachings, the Torah just is now basically futile. The Torah now is irrelevant. And when you focus on observing the Torah, you're taking your attention off of grace and off of, what Jesus did for you. So that's been the historical antipathy of Christianity to Torah observance. We know that only in our modern times has the Messianic Jewish movement, and somewhat in the Hebrew roots movement, there's been a re-engagement with the Torah. And we see what's happening, that both of these movements are really leading to more and more and more people in the church leaving altogether and, basically coming towards the Torah. So I think you see from this story in Acts 21 that Paul has an attitude that I'll do what it takes. And I don't think he's being totally sincere. And we see later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he basically spells it out. He actually says it very, very directly in his own words. He says, starting in verse 19. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So Paul says in verse 19, "For since I am free from all, I can make myself a slave to all in order to gain even more people." Meaning that when it comes to winning converts, I'll do what it takes. And now he spells it out in verse 20. "To the Jews, I became like a Jew." For what purpose? To gain the Jews. Meaning that I was willing to play the part of a Torah observant Jew for the purpose of winning these Jews to belief in Jesus. He goes on and he says, "To those under the law, I became like one under the law." In parentheses, he says, "Though I myself am not under the law." For what purpose? He says, to gain those under the law. In verse 21, "To those free from the law, I became like one free from the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under the law of the Messiah, to gain those free from the law. To the weak I became weak in order to gain the weak." He says, "I've become all things to all people. I'm like a chameleon, so that by all means I might save some." Again, Paul articulates his philosophy of the ends justify the means. I'll do what it takes. And it may not be, as we say in Yiddish, glatt kosher. It may not be entirely honest, entirely forthright, entirely transparent, and above board. But Paul has a greater cause, which is saving people. And because he's so desperate to save people, he seems to be willing to cut corners and not to criticize the people that were preaching insincerely or for really corrupt motivation. He really should have criticized them. You don't just tolerate people that are acting inappropriately, but Paul does. Paul tolerates them and even applauds them. He says, "In this I will rejoice," because again, the ends justify the means as far as Paul is concerned. What's interesting, I just want to make a side point. We'll get to this probably in a future session. But who are these opponents of Paul? Paul is speaking here about people that are opposing him, that are preaching for corrupt reasons. So one possibility is that he's referring to here the Judaizers that he refers to later in chapter 3, verse 2. We're going to see next time, well, in 2 weeks, when we get to chapter 3, he refers to these Judaizers, and he attacks them later on. And so it's possible that, the same opponents that he refers to in chapter 3 might be those same opponents he's referring to here. But the problem would be that, he felt that the Judaizers were basically corrupting the entire gospel message. He believed that they were betraying the entire gospel by focusing on works and focusing on observing the Torah rather than focusing on faith in Jesus and in grace. And so it's hard to imagine that Paul would say, I rejoice in what they are preaching. So it may be very difficult to bring chapter 3 opponents here into chapter 1. So probably if Paul is rejoicing in what these people are preaching, so probably from Paul's perspective, they were legitimate believers, meaning that the doctrine that they were teaching was totally legitimate. It's just that they opposed Paul for personal reasons. It's hard to imagine exactly what that might have been, but it seems that that was what was happening. If we can move on to verse 20. So Paul says in verse 20, it's my eager expectation and hope that I will not at all be ashamed, but that this is an issue that Paul frequently brings up, the idea of shame. He says it's my expectation that I will not be ashamed at all, but that with full courage, now as always, the Messiah will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. So from Paul, we see this throughout his writings. Paul puts all of his focus on bringing honor and recognition to Jesus. That's his obsession. That's all he writes about. That's all he talks about. And we know that from the Torah's perspective, from the Tanakh's perspective, this is just misplaced, meaning from the perspective of the Tanakh, every ounce of glory and honor and recognition is to go to the Creator only. And anything that detracts from the honor and glory and recognition and worship of the Creator basically smacks of idolatry. We're not in this world to bring honor and glory to anyone or to anything else. And Paul seems to have a one-track mind that the only thing he really speaks about is, somehow bringing more honor and glory to the Messiah. Now, in verse 23, Paul speaks about, and he hinted at this now in verse 20. I mentioned that he speaks about honoring Jesus in his body, whether by life or death. And he gets back to this. He says in verse 21, I'll just go back to verse 21, for to me, to live is to be with the Messiah, and therefore to die is to gain, meaning that Paul says the greatest thing in the world is to be with the Messiah, and therefore if I die, that'll be a plus. That'll be wonderful because I'll be with the Messiah if I die. He writes in verse 22, if I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. He says that's not going to be ultimate pleasure. For him, ultimate pleasure is being in relationship, being together with Jesus. And if I have to live in the flesh, just separate from Jesus, ultimately a lot of hard work for me. Yet, which I shall choose, I cannot tell. It's very interesting that he seems to be stuck here. He seems to really be pained by knowing which way do I go, what's preferable. And he says this in verse 23, I am hard pressed between the two, meaning that I'm drawn to both working in this world in order to advance the gospel. Obviously, Paul wants to do that. On the other hand, he's drawn to death, because then in death he'll be with Jesus. So he says, I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart, meaning that if I had my druthers, I would die and I would be with the Messiah. For that is far better, Paul says. But then in verse 24, he says, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary, meaning that I have to do that on your account, meaning that, the Buddhists would talk about a bodhisattva, the person that achieves enlightenment but goes back to this world in order to help save others. And Paul basically says that. He says, even though my ultimate desire, if I had my druthers, I'd rather, leave this world and be with Jesus. But he says, in order to help bring more people to faith in Jesus, I'm willing to stay in this dreadful world and have to work hard. And the Torah takes a very opposite point of view. Paul seems to, basically say flat out that he finds death more attractive. Now, he chooses not to die, but not for himself, meaning as far as he's concerned, he'd rather die. Staying in the world is not for his benefit. Staying in the world is for the benefit of others. But in the Torah, we constantly get the message of ubacharta b'chaim, choose life. God says in Deuteronomy 30, I put before you today life and death, blessing and curse, choose life. And the Torah says there that life is observing and listening to the commandments and obeying God and living according to the Torah. I think that this is an incredibly important difference between Christianity and Judaism. And it really, if you go back to the last piece that we did in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, where he spoke about the difference between the Jewish and Christian ideas of Satan, it's really the same idea here as well. Meaning that from a Jewish point of view, why it is so important to choose life is because in this world, we have the ability to grow. We have the ability to improve. We have the ability to overcome resistance. And we have the ability to become bigger people. And that, from a Jewish point of view, is the purpose of being in this world in the first place. God gave us an opportunity in this world to earn our reward in the world to come, to deserve blessing, to deserve the ability to be in the presence of God forever, for eternity. Because if God gave it to us for free, as a free gift without working for it, there's no honor in that. And people feel ashamed to get something as a handout they didn't work for. And so from a Jewish point of view, this world is incredibly important, not only because you can help other people. Imagine that there was no other people in the world. So even if you were the only person, life is important, life is valuable, and you should choose life because you have the opportunity while you're alive to choose to obey God, to choose to follow God, to grow spiritually, to grow intellectually, to grow spiritually, to achieve incredible accomplishments in terms of overcoming resistance. From a Christian point of view, life is not seen as horizontal like this. The Torah, Judaism, sees life as horizontal. We're on a journey. We're on a process. We're heading somewhere. From a Christian point of view, life is vertical. Life is vertical. Believe in the Lord Jesus, the Messiah, and you will be saved. Meaning, from a Christian point of view, it's not because of what you do. What you do is almost irrelevant. That's what Paul says in Galatians 2. If you could be righteous by following the Torah, Jesus died in vain. From Paul's point of view, it's all about accepting what Jesus did for you. You don't do anything. And so from Paul's point of view, it's vertical. And once Jesus dies for you, you're in heaven. And so Paul basically doesn't see any attraction in this world. What can I gain from Paul's perspective? From Paul's perspective, I have nothing to gain in this world. I'm much better off going straight to heaven. And for him, the only reason to be in this world is to help save other people. So we see a very, very different understanding here. It's related, not just of our understanding of the devil and Satan, but also what is our understanding of life? What is life for? What's life all about? My final comment for this first chapter, again, will be one I've shared already 4 times tonight, which is verses 28 to 29, where Paul again distinguishes between the Messiah and God. He writes in verse 28, "And not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God." From God. And then in verse 29, "For it's been granted to you that for the sake of the Messiah, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake." So again, verses 28 and 29 seem to distinguish and differentiate between God and the Messiah, which I believe, again, is consistent throughout all of Paul's writings. So this is what I wanted to share for this first chapter of Philippians. I know that the next chapter is going to be more exciting. This is sort of, if you go through Philippians chapter 1, it's sort of pretty, it is on the boring side, except for a few high points. But it's basically a lot of,
makes sense.
Paul sharing, things that there's not much to engage with in this first chapter.
Right.
So it was good being here with you. I'm glad
likewise.
that there's technical problems.
The good news is
overcome.
The only people who are affected by the technical problems are the people who want to watch live. Everybody else has a free ride. So anyway.
Well, it's always an important thing to learn patience.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Patience, grasshopper.
If you don't be patient, you will eventually become one. That is for sure. So that is a parable of William.
I'm gonna remember that. That is a Williamism.
That's a William. Thank you. That's even better. Williamism. All right, Rabbi. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And it's been fun. And we will see you next time. And everybody else too. Peace, everybody. Shalom, shalom.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד. חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה